clever, inspiring presentation. I really was completely captivated by it, John. Different experience, however, for you, Marijana, smaller company. I mean, just give us a little bit of an insight into your own story.
Well, we've been around since 1944, so quite a small company, and third generation now, and my father and grandmother started it, and my mother, and then now it's 3 brothers and myself. And what we produce, or what we aim to produce, is world-class Chardonnay. So we now export probably half of what we produce, and primarily to the UK, US and Australia. But I think the difference that we have perhaps to a lot of larger companies is we have established relationships with our key customers around the world, and probably a number of those, particularly in the UK and US, we have those relationships that were started 30 years ago are still there today. So I think for us that's very important in how we establish the markets, as we find those right relationships with a great product.
Mm-hmm. So you're a premium play, essentially?
Yes, we are.
Yeah. Do you use the New Zealand story when you're offshore?
Look, we did initially, we do today, but initially New Zealand, we did attend a number of international market trade shows, and we were there as part of New Zealand. And over time, that's changed a little bit too, because we produce Chardonnay, a lot of the New Zealand story is now Sauvignon Blanc. And so we have to work with them, but a little bit outside of that, because we are trying to grow the Chardonnay story out of New Zealand.
Thank you, Mike. I mean, what do you say to somebody wanting to go offshore? I mean, obviously it's not simple. We heard before from John, it can be quite complex. I mean, just what do you say? What sort of advice would you give? Top 3 points.
Well, I think the basics are pretty much the same in building your own domestic business. You know, you need a product, you need a position in the market, and you need the people to do it, and John's eloquently established that. The big challenge of doing that internationally, though, is that it's far from home. Depending on the product that you've got or the service, it depends upon who you need and where, and you need the money. You know, nothing's for free, so you've got to make sure that you've got the balance sheet and you've got the capability and the capacity to be able to achieve what you want to do. But if you don't have a product which people want, then it's going to be extremely difficult.
Just at that high level, David Parker, I mean, you've been both a CEO of a technology company, for the audience in on the ground on A2, so good judgment there. And now you're in the trade and export arena as our Cabinet Minister, driving that out there. I mean, there's clearly, we've heard earlier, that e-commerce does make it easier for smaller players to access the market, but it's not that simple, is it?
No. Really building on something that John touched on, the Productivity Commission pointed out the paradox that the very technologies that enable exploiting international markets with small institutional form mean that both you've got a lot of competition when you do it, because everyone else is chasing down those opportunities too, but also the value of some of those narrow verticals is enormous once they're priced globally. And the both capability and capital requirements to run the race are often a lot larger than people anticipate. And if one of the senses I get, because I meet a lot of technology firms, is that the sense of nervousness of people looking over their shoulder of the competition that's coming from other parts of the world. And so there's this paradox that these opportunities are able to be exploited from New Zealand, but their size is often such that they can be beyond the capital requirements or the size of our capital markets to run the journey. And so people have to be open to both new sources of capital and capability, and aware that not all of these things can be fully exploited from New Zealand.
Peter Chrisp, I mean, at NZTE, I mean, you've got you're opening markets and or getting companies export ready, and to the point where you do have your Fast 700 companies that you're giving a lot of a push to, but you also help the smaller companies with capital. Can you just give us a bit of a sense of how you go about that?
Probably the first thing in terms of advice going to market, the presentation from John was the best presentation I've heard. Most comprehensive presentation about going to market that I've heard in a very long time. So my best advice about going to market at this point in time is listen to that presentation 5 times, because it was very deep and it was very rich, very, very nuanced. Yes. There's a lot in that. So your question's about raising capital to go to market, is it, Fran? Is that what you're asking? Well, I think it's really, for me, the best piece of advice about going to market is that we find in our data that there's a inverse relationship between the number of target markets that a company goes to and its growth rate. In other words, the less markets you go to, the more you grow. And the reason for that is that, and it was all in John's presentation, is that when you focus on a particular market, there's so much you can do to understand that market, to customise that market, to build relationships in that market, and most importantly, put boots on the ground in that market. And I'd put the desire to source capital in there as well, because when you're sourcing capital, you're not sourcing capital generically just to grow a business generically. You're generally sourcing capital with a particular purpose in mind. So thanks to some of the interventions that Minister Parker's made recently with the opening up of the venture capital market in New Zealand, the growth of the venture capital market, we think there'll be a lot more money coming into the market to help grow companies internationally.
Is this, you've built capital over the years, I guess. Have you had to source externally, Marijana? How have you played it out for expansion?
Well, I think for us it's been a slow growth.
Yeah.
As I said, we've been around since 44, but as far as exporting, since about 40 years ago. And so for us it's just been, we've only done it as we've been able to afford to do it. And I think we are small, so the capital requirements is not so large. And to be honest, as a family, we're very lucky that our property was bought by my father and grandmother in 1944. So it helps when you have that property base in Auckland. And so since then, but I think with us, as I mentioned, we made sure that we went into market, that we found the right people. And I think when you're small, to have those key relationships, that really helps because they understand the market. And particularly in the wine business, for us too, just the association with those key, well, they're called influencers now, but for us the wine trade was particularly important, and they championed our wine for us in those particular markets. But again, I think we just went to the key markets that we knew our wine would be well accepted, the UK, US and Australia probably.
Yeah, can I add to that, Fran, because I love the wine industry for many different reasons, but we've also found the wine, we've followed the development of wine internationally, and I'm looking at you, Peter, as well, because you've helped them build the Sauvignon Blanc, how they represent themselves in international markets, how they project themselves to retailers, how they're sort of organised. We've looked at that from a younger industry like Manuka honey to say, how do we go internationally, and are we better to go together, or are we better to go to 50 disparate brands and try and have different conversations? And I think the other point is, we definitely, and this is what's great about New Zealand business, when we're looking to go into a market, Fran, we are talking to people. It is the people. We talk to NZTE, we talk to some friends we've got in wine, we talk to our friends in multivitamins, and it's all about trying to find partnerships that are naturally going to work and resonate with this sort of New Zealand culture and how we do things to build overseas business.
I think too, Fran, I think it's 10, 12 years ago, we established a collaboration here in New Zealand called Family of 12, which are 12 privately owned companies. They're all small apart from one. It's quite a large company, Villa Maria, but still privately owned. And so we joined forces to do joint marketing initiatives primarily overseas, and so that helped with the costs. And now we do it a little bit differently, that we bring a number of key people into the country looking at those 12 wineries. So that's the way when you're smaller, that if you collaborate with others similar size, that you can do joint marketing initiatives.
I mean, this collaboration, we've seen in China the primary sector collaboration, and when I've talked to exporters over the years, Peter, they've often said part of the problem is actually having enough scale to meet the market demand, to actually be able to fulfill orders. I mean, how do we get over this thing about competing against each other internally, but by same token, buddying up so that we can actually service this big market demand out there?
Well, I think there's been a changing ethos in New Zealand. I think there's been an increasingly a desire to collaborate, to compete. Actually, I think the wine industry has been at the sharp end of that for a very long time. It's been the most successful model, primarily because of the industry structure and the story is such a bonding story.
It's very family.
Yeah, and there's a few different clusters of that, and you've got New Zealand wine industry as a whole through the wine growers, so it's been quite a successful model, and the tide has risen on the whole industry. But we've got in our portfolio about 23 different collaborations. They're very challenging. Honey's now is an obvious one. There's been a lot of things that have been quite tricky in the industry to sort out, but they are increasingly collaborating to compete. If I was going to name a success factor for good collaboration, it's like almost any part of business, it's leadership. So if you get a good, strong leader in the middle of a collaborative activity across a range of companies, that's when things come together. Because there's a lot of things. It's like a really complicated, multifaceted marriage. You've got to put a lot of different factors together to collaborate, to compete. But it can be done, as the one you've mentioned, one of the most successful ones, which is the primary sector collaboration to China. It's about 8 different companies in there. They've been at it for a while now. And that's a guy called Andy Borland from Scales. He's the central leader in there that's sort of bonded that whole thing together.
Yeah, I mean, David Parker, leadership also comes at ministerial levels, opening doors, new trade agreements, and also taking trade missions. You've done one to China. Do you have any more that you're thinking about, business missions?
I'm actually off to Fiji with one next week.
There you go.
But Korea, early, either late this year, probably early next year, India. Off to Europe with one in a few weeks' time as well. Yes. So we do try and open doors like that. In this sort of age of rising protectionism, you have to have many layers of your strategy for your country in order to minimise the risks, whether it's bilateral agreements, plurilateral agreements like CPTPP, activism within the most important rules, which are the WTO, or trade missions, helping people show themselves. Actually, Pete does that well, and one of the things that he would say and has said to me that increasingly sells New Zealand as our provenance, which goes to both, in the case of food safety, but also our reputation for environmental integrity, and our cultural story, and our values, including the values that we increasingly emphasise from our Indigenous background, our Maori culture. And all of those are part of the New Zealand brand story that assists, but they also all have to be underpinned by the product or service that people want to buy.
And I would say, even though it's very tough going to global markets from New Zealand because we're so small and so far away, I'm getting increasingly optimistic about the emergence of our brand story in New Zealand. While the rest of the world is going to hell in a handbasket, we kind of come together a bit, and the strength of our brand story. The Prime Minister actually said it yesterday at the United Nations. He said, the most sustainable food production system in the world, producing wellness for the world, is a very important positioning statement for our whole food sector. And I think, there's a lot about this country that is coming together around some very, very deep values in our food story. I think it's going to be incredibly compelling on the international markets, and is where a lot of these premium markets are going to. So I think we've really got a lot going for us in this regard.
Yeah, and I think that we're well known for producing really good products, whether or not it's food products or beverage products or technology products or services. One of the big things that I think has changed, and we were talking about this earlier, Marijana and I, coming from family businesses, is that the new generation of businesses are much more focused on how to get their product, which they've worked hard to come up with, which is something that is competitive, onto that global stage. And they owe it to their product, not necessarily to themselves, to build a great business. And they're much more willing, therefore, to bring on extra capital. Often it's the control factors which have meant, this is my business, I'm building it for generations ahead. These more modern businesses say, geez, I really want this product to succeed. And John's story with Manuka Health, that's probably the 4th owner now, I think, John. And that's a really great story, because without those 4 owners, there is no way that product probably would have got to where it would have got to.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I'd say as the business grows, you are pushing up into bigger retailers internationally, Boots, Pharmacy, Costco, you know, lots and lots of examples. They love the New Zealand story. I agree with Peter, that's strong and vital to pushing future growth. But they also want to know you've got capital to invest in innovation. Often the big guys have come down to see us. So they say, yep, love New Zealand. Beautiful, prominent story. Manuka's native to New Zealand. But they want to see you've got infrastructure and capacity behind it. And in our case, and I know lots of other cases, you are seeing very well invested supply chains of good, high quality factories meeting MPI requirements, everything else that gives these people confidence to back these brands out of New Zealand.
What does tend to happen, however, is having built a toehold in a very exciting brand, at some stage to take it to the next phase, somebody swoops in, buys it, and puts it somewhere else in the globe. How do we feel about that? I mean, is there ever going to reach a point where we actually have sufficient depth in our own capital markets to sustain it further and perhaps still contain that ownership with offshore partners?
Yeah, look, if that's coming to me, I'm proud of what we've built. Our business is or was a New Zealand business.
Yes.
Manuka honey is native to New Zealand. It always will be. So that's not about selling to move that brand and production offshore. It's about something that's firmly anchored in Aotearoa, also with other businesses. It's about how this resonance with the local provenance story, I guess, would I say. It depends on the business, but certainly that's my experience. It's well and truly anchored here, and it's not moving abroad, but that's our type of business.
I'd say something to that. I think that's a decision for the owner.
Yes.
And I don't think a government should ever prevent that happening. But it should not be, there shouldn't be a disproportionate number of those companies being forced into early exits or excessive sell downs as a consequence of the inadequacy of our own capital markets. So to the extent that it is, and it is partly in New Zealand caused by the inadequacy of our early stage capital markets, we do have to do better because it's a race. And all these people in the audience here building businesses, I suspect it will always be building new businesses. But this one-time opportunity born of this technology revolution, which is the confluence of affordable computing power, sensors, robotics, big data, artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, and an understanding of genetics, means that there is just this huge exponential growth and opportunity. But everyone sees that in the world, and so it's the duty of every country and every business sees it as their opportunity to get ahead. And so this will turn one day into the law of diminishing returns rather than exponential growth. And in the meantime, we've got to be applying as much human and financial capital to this sector of our economy so that we get more than our fair share, and people follow the money. So the capital incentives that you have, or the capital allocation decisions that are made within a country, can be influenced by government, and it's our responsibility to do so.
Do you think 300 million is enough? Or is that just a first round?
It's a big start because it'll be matched one or two times. It'll be upwards towards $1 billion of additional capital into those sort of Series A and Series B capital rounds. That'll help. Does it mean, Rocket Lab, I think, has raised $200 million in the last year? Well, that sort of capital journey is unlikely to be funded out of the New Zealand capital markets. And it's natural that relies upon deeper pools of capital coming from overseas. But as I say, those are decisions for companies, but they ought not to be driven by inadequate capital sources in New Zealand.
The tax...
I think that $1 billion is going to make a huge difference. I think it will switch the problem from being the availability of good quality venture capital to being the availability of good quality companies that are prepared and ready to pitch for that capital and have the strategy and the business structure that actually receive capital and grow accordingly. And by the way, just a bit of a plug, the government released its economic plan yesterday.
I was going to bring that up.
And there are 8 shifts on that economic plan. And it's on the MB website. It's definitely worth a read. And one of those shifts is deeper capital markets, and that really is quite a significant intervention in this economy.
And also those tax changes for about feasibility studies as well. That'll be very valuable to
Yeah, some of that black hole expenditure can now be amortised over time. R&D tax incentives. It's a complex web of things that need to happen, including, for my opinion, we've got over-regulated ordinary capital raising in New Zealand. So some interesting recommendations from the Capital Markets Task Force that's just reported to the NZX that we need to have a look at.
Just before we go to the audience, with our two entrepreneurs, can you just give us perhaps an example of some real awful hurdle you might have had to come along the way? I mean, it sounds as if oh gosh, there have been more than one, obviously. I mean, what do you actually face on the ground? I mean, it was a very polished presentation, but sometimes you really must come up against it.
Oh, absolutely. And that you learn from those and you get stronger. Look, I think that big thing about if you've got something very special, and New Zealand produces a lot of these things, you are going to get an initial wave of demand from a lot of countries. And I think the risk with that is if in the excitement of that and with your appetite to grow, if you take too many of those, you seed your brand of business into a lot of markets. And then by the time you turn around and really understand what you've got to control in those markets, things like I said, of price and channels and so forth, that can be a scary moment, because once it's out of the bag, a good thing is going to grow quickly. So unpacking that sort of stuff. I think the other thing is getting, to Marijana's point, right, taking time to get partner relationships right in market. Again, if you've got a big growth appetite, as we had particularly with private equity, which is the nature of the beast, if you move a little bit too quickly, or you've got a concern over values or capabilities, you move a little bit too quickly, it might be 6 months, it might be a year down the track, but to unpack distributor relationships in particular that aren't working costs you a lot of time, it costs you a lot of money and a lot of resource to do it. So take your time to get those right.
In our case, probably our biggest challenge, and it helped being small and nimble, it was actually in the early 2000s, we had a challenge with cork. At that stage, all of the New Zealand industries closures were cork. And we actually had, for a small company, we had to return, it was close to 1,000 cases out of the US of our Chardonnay back, because the cork taint was probably 10 to 20% we estimated of that wine. And the problem wasn't that people would recognise the cork taint. A lot of our customers just didn't recognise good wine. So we made the decision, we brought the wine back at huge expense, and at that time we went through a process and decided to go completely look at another closure, and that's where we went to screw cap, sorry. And we were the first company to completely go 100% screw cap. And look, initially the US said, we're not going to, and that's going to be a problem for us, and we will have to look at it. But within 6 months they took it, and it's just, we never looked back. And now I think the New Zealand industry is over 90% screw cap, which has been fantastic.
I think I failed more than anyone else up here. I had an early start as an entrepreneur that went really well, and I became overconfident. And I can remember when I'd pulled out of the legal partnership, I was doing 8 GST returns, and a couple of the ventures I was involved in started going sour, and I didn't have the capital base to save any of them. And effectively what was going well just all went down the gurgler in favour of the things that weren't, and I was insolvent. It was the most stressful period of my life, and it's actually turned some of the brickbats that you get in politics, put them into context for me. It took me quite a while to forgive myself for those failures. And in the end, it was actually more of the people around me who forgave me, and I sort of started again. But I've never made that mistake again. I've never tried to do too much. And I've always had an awareness that the absolute importance of capital buffers. And then I was lucky enough to be tied up with some other people who carried me along in my next phase of sort of moving into, you know, A2 milk and Bliss Technologies and other things. But don't spread yourself too thin, and don't underestimate how much capital you need when you inevitably hit bumps.
That's good advice. I think now we're about to go back to Simon and to the audience for your questions.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Fran. Thank you very much to our panellists. The questions have been flowing in. I've got dozens of them here, and you are clearly very engaged with them. And John's presentation clearly resonated as well, as there are a number of questions specifically addressed to him. I will intersperse those with general questions, so you're not doing all the talking, John. We'll take a little bit of the pressure off. But one question has leapt to the top. It's got twice as many upvotes as the rest. How did Manuka honey address the issue with Amazon and anonymous online sellers impacting on your brand?
Yep, we've got another half an hour or just...
30 seconds, go.
Look, it's complicated. It's really complicated. My sales team just got sick of me asking what's our percentage of the buy box. It is complicated. There are low barriers to get your product onto Amazon, which is part of the appeal for a lot of brands. So if you're small, you can get on, you can get started. How we solved that particular issue, Simon, is we just had to dive down deep and source out all of these listings on Amazon under our own brand and where they were coming from. And if there were 40 of our brand, and often most of those selling below our recommended price, it's just about trying to find those and trying to get them off. And look, Amazon does have some regulations, so you can work with Amazon, but in the early days, it's just about trying to control your inventory so that there's less risk that you're just going to proliferate your brand through other resellers on Amazon.
The delicate balancing act the whole way, of course.
Yeah,
I'm going to try and get through as many questions as possible as we're limited with time. This one's a generalist question, but it's come through quite clearly in second place, and I think I'll address this to you, Minister. It's very simple, but it seems to have some nuanced layers to it. Is the goal of all New Zealand businesses to be acquired?
No.
No, there we go, right.
No, I think the goal of just about every business is to grow profit. And also for people who know that they can't run the whole of the journey, they actually have to choose a time when they capitalise their future profits and exit. There are some businesses, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name.
Marijana, 75 years in business.
Absolutely wonderful, and that's an entirely appropriate model. And actually, most of our land-based businesses have the same model in New Zealand. So, no.
I suspect there may have been a little bit of cynicism in the question as well. We'll get back to John. Oh, no, something's leapt up. How do we help, I'll ask you this one, Marijana. How do we help smaller SMEs and women-led SMEs to succeed in global markets?
Again, I think it's based on relationships. I think and there's a number of opportunities through trade shows that you go, and I think if you establish those relationships with key people in those markets, I think that's particularly important.
Have you noticed a global network of women when you're out in the international markets? There are networks we know here in New Zealand.
Well, there are. There's a Women in Wine in New Zealand, and there is a global network of that. But generally, you find in the trade shows that we attend that there is, it's a broad base of customers, not particularly women or men. So.
Okay.
Can I just add to that? I think we find that exporting is an inherently lonely business, and yet there's actually quite a strong psychological desire of people to reach out to their peers. And I'll put and a lot of women reaching out to women is actually a very powerful dynamic. So we do quite a bit to sort of organise those networks and help people come together. I think it was a big part of John's presentation. The whole humanity of this exercise is really crucial. So I think building those networks is an absolutely crucial part of resilience.
Thank you very much. Back to John Kippenberger. I'll get to you, Mike, I promise. There's a question coming for you any second. John, how do you balance and prioritise the sales-driven channel strategy versus brand building and marketing activation in entering the global market?
Wow, okay.
You get the tough ones.
Good questions. Look, for the essence for us was you're trying to run them sort of concurrently. Particularly when you're small, you can't invest a lot in your brand because you're in very limited distribution. So if you take a country like America, you just can't go ahead of your brand distribution. So we were doing things like digital. Digital is very powerful these days in order to try and get influencers and consumers that way. But the reality is, as you build into bigger retailer formats, in our case, again, the likes of Whole Foods or bigger supermarkets or retailers, you are going to need to have the capital and the margin to be able to support bigger brand investment. But the honest truth was, we were always lagging the sales. We were pushing sales ahead and knowing that we had to keep brand investment coming just behind that. Then you get to points in some markets where you've actually got to make a big decision to say, right, now we go to the next level. And that's when you start pushing the brand investment ahead, because some of the retailers are just not going to back you into a bigger category without resources and capital behind brand.
All right, thank you for that. Another general one. By selling our successful companies to overseas entities, are we losing control of the New Zealand uniqueness that underpins the intrinsic value of these companies? Peter, maybe you want to have a go at the first one?
Oh, look, I think it's a very nuanced answer. I mean, I was with Sequent the other day, who's developed a lot of underground technology for monitoring underground. If you talk to them, they want to be a unique New Zealand company making a contribution to New Zealand and to the world, but they can't do that without a big international partner. So I don't think it's as binary as that. A lot of companies need to grow into their New Zealandness by partnering internationally.
As you say, there's nuance and shades of grey pretty much to all of these. Unfortunately, there's no binary.
Can I just add to that, Simon? I think one of the things that gets forgotten in this whole area is that you owe it to the product to make it its best in the world. And if you get stuck with capital structure and ownership as the basis on which you are going to deliver that, then you're never going to achieve what the product could actually do. So, Kumeu River Chardonnay, what is the best way to get that to as many people as possible? How do you make sure that Rocket Lab is able to achieve its purpose? Ownership shouldn't necessarily have a big part to play in that story.
Okay, thank you. I'm trying to rip through as many questions as possible to give you a quick overview. I'm sure the panellists would all love to debate every single one of these for quite some time. Back to you, John. What was Manuka Health's unique marketing proposition? What was your UMP against competitors? What was the target audience here nationally and internationally?
Yeah, so good question. A lot of Manuka honey, low barriers to entry. New Zealand produces a wonderful high level of Manuka honey product. So, and the low barriers to entry is you can buy product from a beekeeper, put it in a jar with a brand and sell it through all these multiple channels overseas. So what we were trying to do is pick the base of ours was the New Zealand story, but that's a lot of people's brand propositioning. And then what do we build on top of that? And the founder was strong on science, so we always were backing the science around efficacy and so forth. We were backing ourselves in terms of investment. What was the supply chain? We owned most of the supply chain back to the land, back to the Manuka bush. So science and end-to-end supply chain was certainly a couple.
Does the ability to talk provenance at that point help?
Yeah, but if there's 200 brands in China talking provenance, and 200 brands can hire a drone for $100 a day or nothing from your son and whack up some beautiful pictures and get a website, there's no point of difference. It's how do you build on that, and particularly how do you get in front of these bigger retailers or bigger partners to give them a sense of security that you have got the end-to-end, you've got the provenance, you've got the food safety, you've got a balance sheet that, to Mike's point, that's going to be able to support growth.
Fantastic. I'm going to have to wrap things up because there are goodies for you. And it's going to general question. I think I'll address this to you, Minister. How do we balance global growth with the need for global social and environmental responsibility?
Well, I'm Minister for the Environment. I'm in the middle of a big scrap on water at the moment. Because in truth, we've still got twice as many rivers degrading as are improving. And it's like any brand proposition, for it to be valuable and sustainable in a time sense, it's got to be true. That's how do you make it better? Well, it's a combination of everyone doing their bit, whether it's cities, individuals, farmers, or governments setting the background regulation that people have to meet.
And just to add to that, I mean, I think you've seen a completely change in the construction of this debate, where I think we will only globally grow if we do look after our environment. That's the point is. So we were hugely erode our competitive position if we degrade the environment in New Zealand, because that's the essence of our competitive positioning globally.
I want to wrap things up. Thank you very much. I've got to wrap things up because we're over time. But very, very quickly, I want to go through the panel and ask you for your 10-second piece of advice that makes a difference in going global. John?
Enjoy it and get great people around you.
Mike?
Do your research, pick your market.
David?
Listen to John.
You know who the politician in the room is. Right. Peter?
Focus, focus, focus.
Marijana?
Great product and great relationships.
Great product, great relationships, people, products. It's all coming back to the basics. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please put your hands together for our panellists and keynote speaker.